እዚ ንጽረት ሚድያ እዩ። ንጽረት ሚድያ ዕምቆት ዘለዎም ሓሳባት ምይጣት ቃል ምሕታት ከምኡውን ጽሬቶም ዝሓለዉ መደባት ዝቐርበሉ ሓድሽ ሚድያ እዩ። ንጽረት ሚድያ ንሰብኣዊ መሰል ደቂ ሰባት ዝውክሉ ሓሳባት ብሓድሽ ኣቀራርባ ዝቐርበሉ ጉዳያት ማሕበረሰባት ሰፊሑ ትኹረት ተገይሩሎም ዝዝተየሉ ሚድያ እዩ። ሚድያና ፖለቲካዊ ዋይነት ጥራሕ ከይኮነስ ማሕበራዊ ቁጠባዊ ከምኡውን ባህላዊ ዛዕባታት ብዕምቀት ዝቐርበሉ ሚድያ እዩ። ዕላማና ንጽረት ምፍጣር እዩ። ንጽረት ኣብ ሓሳባት፣ ንጽረት ኣብ ወሰንቲ ማሕበረሰባዊ ጉዳያት። ኣብ ጉዕዞ ንጽረት ሚድያ ሰማዕትና ከምኡውን ተመልከትና ዓብይ ተራ ንክትፃወቱ ንዕድም። ሓሳባዊ ንጽረትን ንሰብኣዊ መሰላት መሰረት ገይሩ ዘይግስግስ ማሕበረሰብ ጽኑዕ ህላውን ቀጻልነት ኣይክህልዎን እዩ።
Welcome to Nizrat Media, where we explore key issues shaping the political landscape of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. I am your host, Getachew Tamara, a graduate student in conflict transformation and peace building in Eastern Maronite University. Today, we have a remarkable guest joining us, Tom Gardner. Tom Gardner is an esteemed journalist from the Economist. We invited him to discuss his latest book, The Abiy Project, God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. This groundbreaking work examines the complex and often controversial tenure of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and unpacking the interplay of religion, conflict, and the political ambitions in one of Africa's most influential nation, Ethiopia. Join us as we delve into the nuance of Ethiopia's recent history, the challenges of the country, and challenges of nation building and the implications of peace and stability. So, first and foremost, thank you, Tom, for your willingness to participate in this interview. I know you have a very tight schedule and you're so busy, but thank you very much for coming to our podcast, to our media. And I would like to start my question by what inspires you to write the Abiy Project, and what do you hope readers will understand about Ethiopia through your book?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was living in Ethiopia and reporting from Ethiopia from 2016 up until, well, living in Ethiopia up until 2022. I've continued reporting on Ethiopia since. You know, it's my contention, and I don't think many of your viewers will disagree. I mean, this has been the most tumultuous period in Ethiopia's history for many decades. It's an extraordinarily important story, an important period in the country's history, and I think we're all trying to make sense of what's happened. I was inspired to write the book because I wanted to contribute in some way in terms of helping myself and hopefully others understand, or at least come towards a better understanding, let's say, of the last few years, and also to share with Ethiopians and people who follow Ethiopian affairs closely, you know, some of the reporting and insights I've managed to acquire over my time there. But it also was an effort at the same time to communicate to people. You know, I'm from the UK, from other parts of the world. Why Ethiopia matters, why this period in Ethiopian history needs to be better understood. So I had two audiences in mind. but also at the same time, with regards to the figure of Abiy, who is obviously at the center of the book, it's both an attempt to chronicle this period of history, as I've just said, but also to provide a portrait or a study of Abiy as best I can, given the slipperiness of the subject. And I think in some regards, we're still at the kind of first drafts of history stage when it comes to Abiy. I mean, he continues to confound expectations, predictions, the kind of established categories for understanding Ethiopian, African, world leaders. I think he is a historical actor, and I think I found that very compelling, and I find him as a figure enigmatic, and I wanted to try through reporting and research to try and get a little bit closer to the bottom. Obviously, I do not claim to have reached the bottom, and I suspect it's impossible to do. But that was part of what interested me and what got me inspired to write the book.
Thank you, Tom. I would argue your book is, as an introductory remarks, your book is one of the most, or I would say even the leading book currently to understand the very complex Ethiopian political landscape, especially starting from 2018 up to the present. But I will ask another follow-up question. So you arrived in Ethiopia, where there was a popular revolt, mostly in Addis Ababa or Oromia. I believe, if I'm not wrong, you came to Ethiopia in 2016, and in Ethiopia from 2014 or 2013 up to 2018, there was a popular revolt in many ways. And how did the events of that year shaped in writing the book, or in shaping your understandings in understanding the Abiy Ahmed's leadership, or even the broader landscape of Ethiopia?
Well, yeah, I mean, I arrived in 2016, which was obviously before Abiy had arrived on the public stage, at least for those who weren't closely following Oromo politics. Obviously, for people watching Oromo politics, he was by the end of 2016, he was vice president of the region, but he was still, nationally at least, not yet a household name, and certainly internationally he wasn't. It was mid to late 2017 that I think more and more people came to understand Lema Magersa, but Abiy was still not the key figure. So that comes later. I think 2016 is an important year. Obviously, I arrived just at the time of the Eritrea tragedy, but that year in Bishoftu in October 2016, and that was, I arrived basically just 2 days before that, and I think firstly it was a dramatic moment to arrive in the country, and it clearly would shape my understanding of the stakes and I think the historical significance of the moment. But even then, I don't think I fully, like many people, didn't fully kind of comprehend really the scale of what was coming, and really that the country was in this kind of epochal transformation. When I moved to Ethiopia, the things that most interested me were the EPRDF's developmental state structural transformation, industrialization, the grand ambitions of that regime, not just inside the country, but regionally. It was it was probably the most intellectually interesting development project or developmentalist project anywhere on the continent. People talked about Ethiopia as the China of Africa. It's potentially a kind of glib journalistic cliche, but it was the sort of thing which I found very interesting. And the other thing I think that I kind of took to Ethiopia as an assumption, and I think this is something I kind of absorbed from reading and studying before that, was the idea of the strong state. Ethiopia's particular history of state building, both post 1991, but also obviously when you look at the longue durée of Ethiopia's historical development as well, Ethiopia had a very distinctively strong state with a political settlement, which is the term that political scientists like to use to describe the EPRDF's kind of the system which was in place. And people, I remember, people like Arkebe Okube, just in his book, Made in Africa, would talk about, use terms like anti-fragility to describe the kind of resilience to shocks that were kind of built into the system. And I think this was quite widely understood. I think when I arrived, people, observers, analysts, diplomats even, would say, as well as many people in Addis Ababa who kind of knew the might of the EPRDF, assumed these protests will ultimately fizzle out because the state is it will crack down, it will clamp down. State of emergency was declared. Ultimately this train, it's been shaken a bit, but it's not going to be forced off the tracks. This is a government with long-term ambitions, anti-fragility baked in. This is China. I know people would maybe say it's more like China than it is, I don't know, about some of its neighbors. So I think it was for me that, I do look back on that because it was a turning point, I think, ultimately, in my understanding about Ethiopia's state. Quite clearly, that those presumptions, those kind of guiding assumptions in the analytical community, scholarly community, and just generally, I think, within among kind of the general consensus about Ethiopia's state, proved wrong. And I should add to that as well, I think what was also clear was that some of the narratives around economic growth were off the mark. The economy was actually slowing, or economic growth was no longer quite at such a high rate. Exports were foundering. Debt to GDP ratios ratio was creeping up. There were all sorts of indicators which were, in hindsight, flashing more red than people, I think, appreciated. And I think a lot of Ethiopians who said, this economy is not what it's, touted by the government, I think they were right. And I think people should have, outsiders or scholars or diplomats or Ethiopian political leaders probably should have recognized that or appreciated that more. Because ultimately what happens by 2018 is this whole system really was falling, was unraveling. And maybe it could have been patched up with a different leader. That's a counterfactual, I guess we will never know. But certainly, Abiy arrived and was able to reach the top of the EPRDF when he did, because the conditions at that point were such that it was both the state and the party, the EPRDF and the Ethiopian state were ripe for a takeover, and Abiy was the person to execute that. Of course, as my book, I don't think he was just, anyone could have done this, or done it in the way that he did, because he is a very unique character, and that's where my book kind of takes off, is trying to understand the particular idiosyncrasies of this leader, who I think you can talk about the Abiy era in Ethiopian history, precisely because it has been shaped by his particular qualities and character in a way that is not always the case in history,
Your book examines the intersection of religion and politics in Abiy Ahmed's leadership. How has his use of religious narratives shaped Ethiopia's political landscape? And at the same time, how has, I would say, the support he received garnered from the international community when he came to power in 2018, and following when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, enabled him to rule the country to his direction as he wants. What are your insights in this perspective?
Well, I'll start with religion, and obviously it's pretty obvious, no secret, that I do put religiosity at the center of my analysis of him. I should start by saying, I think there is a structural point as well. Ethiopia, after 1991, underwent significant social economic changes. Urbanization, the kind of demographic boom, but crucial within that was the growth of the Pentecostal community, and I argue in the book that's perhaps the most profound social transformation. We don't know precisely what the population of this community is, because there hasn't been a census since 2007, but we can assume it's creeping up over 30%, if not more. Who knows, it's probably accelerated since Abiy took power, for various reasons. But Abiy is also the embodiment of that shift. He is that generation that comes to power, particularly in the South, in Oromia, and in the South, wider South, after 1991, that is Pentecostal. And I know there's a bit of controversy around the particular use of, I use it in the book, around the particular term prosperity gospel, but I can assure you Abiy uses the word privately to describe what he is guided by. He told an interlocutor just the other day, this is referring to my prosperity gospel is absolutely at the heart of what I do. And indeed, he said he sees his mission as getting Ethiopians to love the smell of money. That's a recent quote I was privy to. That point being, his religiosity is a kind of individualist form of religiosity, which is informed by prosperity gospel. There is no question about that, even if his particular church, evangelical church, does not subscribe formally to this school. But I clearly put it, I think it's very important. In fact, I go as far as to say that I don't think there's barely any leader in the world that is executing or putting into practice the ideas of prosperity gospel, to a greater extreme than Abiy in Ethiopia. I think it informs an enormous amount of his idea of development, which is this kind of American style capitalist evangelical Republican mindset around individual thriving and uplift, but also this idea that that the blessed is the man who with earthly riches. There is this kind of entwining of earthly splendor and divine favor, and I think Abiy sees that as as kind of as pretty essential to his worldview. And I think you can see that now, and you have been, I mean, it's turbocharged now, but even when I was in Addis, the transformation of Addis Ababa, this kind of wholesale beautification of the city, so that it kind of is almost like the city on the shining city on the hill in kind of King Solomon's Jerusalem. I think that is, really important to understanding his politics. So that's I write a lot about that in the book. Not so much about prosperity gospel, but a more general point that's not specific to doctrine, but to just a more general sense of divine purpose. He clearly believes he was sent by God, and you speak to his people who've worked with him or interacted with him across the board. This is something that people take away from conversations. I mean, he's always praying with his visitors. He's always praying with his colleagues in cabinet meetings, hallelujah, amen. This is this is someone who believes he is doing God's work. And that is really important to understand in the last few years, because it means he feels emboldened to take kind of risks that most politicians wouldn't take, and to go to extremes that others wouldn't go, because, if you are touched by God, there is no limit. And then finally, I would just say all of this has led to a kind of return on some level of religion to the public sphere. Religious groups from different, not just from Pentecostal or Christian, but also Muslim, have definitely become more prominent in the kind of public sphere than they were previously. There has been an erosion somewhat of that divide between church and state, which I completely recognize. The EPRDF transgressed as well, but for different reasons and in different ways. Abiy has actually returned kind of religious language to the public sphere. As I'm sure all remember, his first speech to Parliament, his inaugural address in 2018, ended with "God bless Ethiopia." That was always people. That was what people took home from that, almost more than anything else. So that's really, really important. I know there are moves afoot now with a new kind of secular bill around the kind of church-state divide and secularism in Ethiopia, and that's a really complicated issue, which is quite complicated to understand what's guiding that. I do think to some degree this is about putting the Orthodox Church back in the box, particularly. As you know, Abiy's relationship with the Orthodox Church has been more confrontational than it has, or much more, strained than his relationship with the Protestant churches, and actually the Muslim community. I think the relationship with the Orthodox Church, I think that's the target of this kind of secularism bill. That is something quite different, and I think he sees that the Orthodox Church to some degree as a threat, and that has been and ultimately it's political threats to his power that guides the kind of the response that becomes the use of repressive force to degrees we've seen in Tigray first and foremost, but also Oromia and now Amhara. He does not He does not accept challenges to his political position.
Mm-hmm.
That is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's his use of religious narratives, whether it is implicitly or explicitly, has contributed to his leadership in many ways. And the other question I was going to ask is, it is really impossible to talk about Abiy Ahmed's leadership without talking about the Tigray war. And the Tigray war and its aftermath, features prominently in your analysis. What do you see as the key lessons from the Tigray war, and could you also walk us the phases of the war, mostly how it started and how it was fought in the middle, and then of course you were deported, I would say, in 2022, if I'm not wrong. And
2022.
yes, and then you have reported extensively, not only on the Tigray war, but also in the political landscape of the country. Yeah, so my question is, of course, you have talking, you have discussed prominently in your book about the Tigray war as well. So, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the Tigray war is kind of pretty fundamental to the narrative arc of the book, right? It's I start by telling the story of Ethiopia, the kind of deep background to Ethiopia in the last few decades in particular. But I have done so through the biography of Abiy Ahmed. But ultimately, of course, by the second half of the book, it is about building toward. I am charting the journey towards the start of the Tigray war, and the book ends more or less, save for the epilogue, with the Pretoria Agreement, and that is for two reasons. I mean, one is a kind of practical reason. I left Ethiopia in 2022. I have not been able to report on the country to the same degree, obviously certainly not on the ground, since the Pretoria Agreement. But I also think it is important to acknowledge that the Tigray War, as much as the civil war in Oromia and in Amhara are essential to understanding Abiy in this period of Ethiopian history, and they're not unrelated. These are all conflicts which stem to some degree, in varying degrees, from revolts against Abiy or contestations to Abiy's hold on power and refusal to share it or dilute it. So in that respect, we are dealing with a kind of common civil conflict that encompasses the whole country. But the Tigray War is also on a scale that has not been matched. It is quite clearly unsurpassed in terms of the intensity, in terms of the character of the warfare, the degree of which it was kind of heavy weapons and armies, different degrees of Oromia and Amhara, but it all came to a head in Tigray on a scale that was not matched elsewhere. And of course, that is in large part because the adversary he faced there was that much stronger, much more better armed, The Tigrayan community was clearly, for reasons of the last few decades, targeted and in a way by the rest of Ethiopian society, which we have not seen in other parts of the country to the same degree. And it's frankly the sheer death toll, which is simply has not been seen. It's not been close to being matched anywhere else. So I do take the Tigray War as, you know, for now we don't know where history is going, but for now it is the standout event, the unsurpassed catastrophe of the Abiy era, and so it was core to the narrative and structuring of the book. As to your question about its causes, I'm not going to rehash, blow by blow. I think many of your, if not all of your viewers will be familiar. And what I hope to do in my book was to chronicle it and document it, that path to war, as thoroughly as possible. But not everything didn't capture every single twist and turn. But the crucial point really that I made was that this confrontation between Abiy and the TPLF, I mean, absolutely was a power struggle. I don't argue that the TPLF was aiming to return itself to kind of power in Addis Ababa. I'm quite skeptical of that view, but certainly they regarded Abiy and his project as both an existential threat to Tigray for understandable reasons, but also as an existential threat to the character of the Ethiopian state that was, that they had been, first the key architects of. So there was an ideological dispute here about the nature of Ethiopia, how power is configured and shared, and I think they saw Abiy. I think ultimately still do see Abiy as an existential threat to that, and took the decision to prepare for war. At the same time, Abiy was regarding the TPLF as the single most powerful obstacle to his political project, to his attempt to reshape Ethiopia in his own image, to restructure Ethiopia's state along, the lines that he still, I believe, wants. And TPLF were obviously the most organized force and obstacle to that. So he, along with his and I think we still don't really know the kind of exact balance of power in that relationship and who was egging on the other. But I don't claim to have been in the room with them, and I don't think anyone I know, no one else was. So take anyone who claims to know exactly what was decided between them, take those claims with a pinch of salt. But quite clearly, at some point in the course of 2020, there was Ethiopian politics required a military solution. So by 2020, I argue in the book that the COVID crisis obviously sparked the constitutional crisis, which was an accelerant for a showdown between these two forces, which was pretty much bound to happen by that point. Not inevitable. It was never inevitable. Different choices could have been made. But by 2020, I think, it's pretty clear where this is going. And then, of course, the drama around the election accelerated the clash even more. Though, of course, I don't believe that the election in and of itself was the reason. Just as I don't believe that the attack on the Northern Command was in and of itself the reason for the war. This was a fundamentally a kind of a structural conflict that was going to have to be resolved somehow, and it looked by 2020 that it would be done so militarily.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Your book has explained more this in depth, and for our viewers, I would invite to buy your book, The Abiy Project, God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. And my next question is, so many analysts, I would say, especially from the international community, excluding you and the others, I would say, try to analyze, the Tigray war as a power struggle, a simple power struggle, without considering the existential, threat faced by the community, starting not only 2020 but also around 2019, 2018, when the media, the government structure, and the Ethiopian society, especially the elite, have supported the propaganda for war, or kind of considering, the Tigrayan community as the sole beneficiaries of, the system which was in power from 1991 to 2018. And in your book, you have incorporated a lot of things from, Abiy Ahmed, this leadership. Even before he became the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, he was one of the very strong spymen in the country. His positions, senior positions in the government, either in the federal or in the regional state of Oromia, were also highlighted. So my question is, not only the international community, but even for Ethiopians, how should we analyze, the Tigray war and the other wars, maybe, but mostly focusing on the Tigray war, and to explain, the power structure or the atrocities committed, within Tigray in the other parts of the country, and the road towards transitional justice.
Also acknowledge that you can't understand, why the Tigrayan leadership and society, prepared for conflict without understanding the deep existential fear of the people that were encircled physically from very early on in the quote unquote transition from 2018. Roads were being blocked into Tigray. It was being slowly asphyxiated, and of course, at the level of media and propaganda, Tigrayans were being scapegoated and used as the kind of explanation for every single conflict, violent incident that happened in the country. I remember being in Gedi-Oguji, talking to local officials there about the causes of that conflict, which can only be understood as a local conflict. It was linked to the national, what was going on at the national level. That's why it exploded when it did. But the local officials were essentially blaming TPLF, and that was just one example. This was happening the entire time, whether it was, Gedi-Oguji, or the conflicts in Benishangul, or even in Addis Ababa, where there were incidents, whether it was assassinations as well. Of course, most famously, the Hachalu assassination. Tigrayans became the kind of all-purpose villain of Ethiopian society, and as a result, the violence once it began. And I'm a bit unclear, and I don't know, what level Abiy expected or even wanted the kind of violence that occurred. He, of course, didn't, because I do think he
Lost your connection, Tom.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Your line was breaking a little bit, so you can start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before the war, the rhetoric and the general direction with which Ethiopian society was taking with regards to demonizing the Tigrayan community as the source of all its ills, of everything.
Again, lost your connection. I think. Can you hear me now, Tom? Hello? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. There was, yeah. So you were, yeah, I can hear you now. You were discussing about the demonization, or the propaganda even before the war, and but yeah, you have been cutting off for almost maybe a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I was just to say that that rhetoric and that demonizing of the Tigrayan community before the war was then absolutely intrinsic to the way it was fought, which of course resulted in the genocidal quality of the fighting, the massacres, I think, which are more numerous and more widespread than we really even appreciate. Many, well, not Tigrayans, but outsiders generally appreciate. And then, of course, not just that, but the ethnic cleansing of Western Tigray, and then the use of famine as a weapon of war. All of this was made possible by the fact that Tigrayans had been dehumanized for a long time before the war began, so that there was a general level of tolerance towards kind of Tigrayan civilian casualties, which was quite shocking. And I think that when on your question of transitional justice, I mean, this is going to be the hardest part. And I don't think for one second that there is about to be a genuine process of transitional justice. That's not on the cards, and that is quite clearly not going to be allowed by the government. But were it to happen, yes, some sort of reckoning with the actual scale, because I think what's still not fully acknowledged or appreciated, and partly that may be to do with the kind of effectiveness of government propaganda, but also perhaps a kind of just a troubling refusal to listen and believe Tigrayan testimonies and accounts by people not just within Ethiopia, but by many people in the international community. And by the way, I missed perhaps almost the most important one, which was rape. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you cannot make sense of that without accounting for this extraordinarily dangerous tendency towards dehumanizing Tigrayans that was visible before the war began, but once the war began, reached horrifying heights, fueled by government officials from Abiy Ahmed down. And the buck does stop with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The question of transitional justice is very critical for the of course the Tigrayan community because of the intensity of the genocidal nature of the war, and how many thousands of especially women and girls are still suffering from the horrific sexual violence. And in this month, we are celebrating the second year, of the anniversary of the Pretoria Agreement. I know you said that your book stopped around the Pretoria Agreement, but for our viewers and for a general information, how do you measure the implementation, or how do you see, I would say, the implementation of the Pretoria cessation of hostilities? My looking ahead, what do you think are the most significant obstacles to achieving lasting peace and stability in the country?
Well, my view on the Pretoria Agreement now is that it was enormously welcome at the time, and you can whether you describe it as a surrender by the TPLF, TDF, or something more equitable. I show in the book that it wasn't quite a surrender. Abiy did at the time make concessions, but irrespective of that, it was crucial. It stopped the bloodshed. It silenced the guns, and I think we cannot, as bad as things are now in Ethiopia and in Tigray, that has to be acknowledged. So I do that first. But 2 years on, I think we have to also recognize that this was never a peace agreement, frankly. It was certainly not a comprehensive political settlement. That was to come later. This was really just a peace deal. Not a peace deal. This was really just a ceasefire. Because the elements that were to come later, almost all the crucial ones have failed to be implemented. And what worries me is that we are seeing a repeat of history. In that 1998 to 2000, the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea ended with the Algiers Agreement, and that was never fully implemented. In effect, it was a ceasefire. That is what I fear is happening again. And as a result, the cycle of war will all too likely continue. And I think I wrote this in a recent article in The Economist, which the Ethiopian government was very unhappy with. But I do think whether there is a plan for war against Eritrea now, it's sort of beside the point. The point is that it's without a comprehensive settlement, which includes Eritrea, which includes Amhara, which is also, you know, another significant fallout of the Pretoria Agreement. There isn't going to be a lasting peace. We can't talk about transitional justice without pulling in all these different groups. So it's all frankly really concerning in my view, because nothing has really been addressed. And the Pretoria Agreement was supposed to lay out a path for the resolution of political conflicts through dialogue, and that hasn't happened. So, you know, we are one mistake, one misfire, one misstep away from a resumption of conflict. And I think there needs to be a bit more of an honest reckoning within. I'm now talking towards the international community, who are I think the ones who have their heads most in the sand around this. But you know, this was a ceasefire. It wasn't a peace deal, and until there is a peace deal, we can't assume that this is really over. So yeah, that's I'm afraid my bleak prognosis, and I hope to be proven wrong.
So let me ask you your final thoughts with regard of course, this is out of your your book. I'm going to ask your observation or your assessment. There are, you know, different conflicts going on in Ethiopia, including the Amhara and in Oromia, and the country will conduct election, of course, maybe after 2 years. The international community support, either through the World Bank or IMF, seems to be continuing in a very alarming rate, without, you know, considering, I would say, the crimes, wars, and whatever, you know, atrocities the Prime Minister and his government are committing in the country, or have committed, perpetrated, for instance, in Tigray and the other parts of the country. Of course, in your book, you have put a very optimistic ending in your closure, I would say, not with regard to Abiy Ahmed's leadership, but with the prospect of the public, the Ethiopian public, how, you know, to see or to kind of expect their country should go forward. And my question is, how do you think Abiy Ahmed can garner support and be elected in the next election, or what will be the kind of the fate or destiny of the conflicts either in Amhara or in Oromia in the coming maybe 3 to 4 years?
I'm afraid I'm going to dodge that question slightly and say, you know, the lessons of the last 5-6 years in Ethiopia proves that, you know, making any predictions is a fool's game. We don't know where things are going. I worry about the state of the country and its economy and on its current trajectory. I don't think Abiy is going anywhere, though. In fact, his perspective, as he says privately recently, is that he's less than 50 years old. He can expect 20 to 30 more years unless he's assassinated. So that's the way he thinks. But I think any election, on your point of elections, I don't expect it. The election will be I'm not really even thinking about it seriously. it's the last one was a charade, and obviously he was not going to leave. As I quoted someone saying, I think someone close to him saying he will leave no stone unturned. That was back in 2021, 2020. The opposition is so much weaker now. There is no civil political opposition. There is only armed opposition, and the armed opposition is not strong enough to overthrow him. Abiy's political opponents are either co-opted, in the case of Bahanu Nega and others, but or they're kind of completely neutralized in silence and in exile. So there's no political opposition. It's only armed opposition, and I don't think the armed opposition is strong enough to overthrow him. But, and I'll just say this on my last point, we don't know, because any sort of surprise could be in store, including, if there is a war with Eritrea, and I know there are people around Abiy who talk about this as kind of inevitable. Certainly in Asmara they say so too. That would be the last one adventure too many. I hope that is not what it comes to. I sincerely do. So I'm afraid not an optimistic note, but I think we have to be a bit realistic at this point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I really thank you, Tom Gardner, for coming to Nizrat Media and share your thoughts with regard to your book. And for our viewers, you can buy Tom Gardner's book in different book platforms, including Amazon and the others. The Abiy Project, God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia is really, really an informative and groundbreaking book if you really want to understand and comprehend the current political landscape and about Ethiopia in many ways. So I really thank you for your input, and hopefully we will talk to you again next time.
Thank you very much, Getachew. It was a pleasure to be on, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
እዚ ንጽረት ሚድያ እዩ። ንጽረት ሚድያ ዕምቆት ዘለዎም ሓሳባት፣ ምይይጣት፣ ቃል ምሕታት ከምኡ'ውን ጽሬቶም ዝሓለዉ መደባት ዝቐርበሉ ሓድሽ ሚድያ እዩ። ንጽረት ሚድያ ንሰብኣዊ መሰል ደቂ ሰባት ዝውክሉ ሓሳባት ብሓድሽ ኣቀራርባ ዝቐርበሉ፣ ጉዳያት ማሕበረሰባት ሰፊሑ ትኹረት ተገይሩሎም ዝዝተየሉ ሚድያ እዩ። ሚድያና ፖለቲካዊ ዋይነት ጥራሕ ከይኮነስ ማሕበራዊ፣ ቁጠባዊ ከምኡ'ውን ባህላዊ ዛዕባታት ብዕምቀት ዝቐርበሉ ሚድያ እዩ። ዕላማና ንጽረት ምፍጣር እዩ። ንጽረት ኣብ ሓሳባት፣ ንጽረት ኣብ ወሰንቲ ማሕበረሰባዊ ጉዳያት። ኣብ ጉዕዞ ንጽረት ሚድያ ሰማዕትና ከምኡ'ውን ተመልከትና ዓብዪ ተራ ንክትፃወቱ ንዕድም። ሓሳባዊ ንጽረትን ንሰብኣዊ መሰረት ገይሩ ዘይግስግስ ማሕበረሰብ ጽኑዕ ህላውን ቀጻልነት ኣይክህልዎን እዩ።